April was sitting in her office, deep in thought. She was trying to decide whether she should go to the reunion or not. It just so happened that her most unpleasant memories have all happened during her school years. April shuddered at the mere thought of her past, then glanced at the calendar. God, has it really been 10 years already? And I still remember everything to the smallest detail, as if it happened yesterday. The woman whispered and brushed away a tear that was running down her face. Knowing that the reunion would probably be held in a restaurant, April decided to prepare a little surprise for everyone. The woman hadn't decided yet what exactly it would be, but she knew for sure that it would have something to do with her past. Unbeknownst to herself, April plunged into memories that immediately swirled her in a whirlpool of images from her past. Few people knew that April Dawson's childhood was difficult and bleak. Her life could have probably turned out rather differently if it weren't for one particular event that turned everything upside down. The reason for everything that happened in her life was a terrible car accident that April's parents had gotten into at the very moment when April was at daycare playing with the rest of the kiddos. Robert and Julia Dawson weren't responsible for the accident and became victims of a drunk driver who drove into the oncoming lane. The head of the family died immediately on impact, while his wife was a little more fortunate. Julia Dawson suffered extensive injuries to her entire body and facial lacerations caused by shrapnel from the shattered windshield. The doctors did the impossible and literally pulled the young woman from the other side. Unfortunately, Julia's injuries turned out to be very extensive and eventually caused her to lose her eyesight. 5-year-old April didn't share the fate of her parents only because she was at daycare at the time of the car crash. But when the girl saw her mother with the strange bandage over her eyes, her heart skipped a beat. Having lost her eyesight, Julia became completely helpless and couldn't come to terms with her condition for a long time. It took enormous strength of character for the woman to find it in herself to continue living. Of course, if it weren't for her little daughter, Julia might not have managed to pull through. Thus, knowing that April was waiting for her mother to come home, the woman defeated death and returned to the new world where pitch-black darkness, dark glasses, and a cane were waiting for her. Since Julia grew up in an orphanage, she simply had no relatives to help her out. The parents of her deceased husband lived on the other side of the country, and due to their old age and poverty, couldn't help the unfortunate widow who was left alone in the hostile world. Little April was the only person to support Julia during her first months out of the hospital. The girl used to tell her mother that it was just a game of hide and seek and that her eyesight would soon return. It was her daughter who helped Julia take her first timid steps into the realm of darkness that enveloped her whole life. April often saw her mother crying silently in her bedroom. At moments like these, the little girl dreamed of becoming a witch who could use her magic wand to restore her mother's eyesight and resurrect her father. Unfortunately, the reality turned out to be much worse than the little girl's dreams and hopes. They all got shattered when April started elementary school. Despite the fact that the girl became one of the best students in the class in record time, her peers couldn't help but point out how poorly she was dressed. At first, those were harmless jokes that April tried to ignore. The girl knew that her sick mother was waiting for her at home, and therefore she didn't want to get so upset over something so unimportant. But time passed, and the nitpicking of her classmates became more and more sophisticated and cruel. The children often screamed at her, saying, "You're the daughter of a blind beggar. Go beg for money at the train station. Maybe then you could afford to buy new clothes." At times like these, April's eyes filled with tears. Deep down, the girl knew that her peers were right. April's clothes did look rather bad, since they were all bought in thrift stores or flea markets. Returning home, the girl never told her mother about her problems, because she knew that she wouldn't be able to help and would only get even more upset and start crying again. Instead, April told her mother stories about how she was doing well at school, so her mother had nothing to worry about. In order to at least somehow improve the family's financial situation, Julia got a job through the Center for People with Disabilities. There, she assembled electrical switches, clothespins, and many other items that didn't require special skills and could be assembled by touch. Now, on her way to school, April took her mother to the specialized building for the blind, where she worked 6 or even 8 hours a day. After school, the girl picked up Julia from work and led her home by the hand. If April got out of school early, she came by her mother's work and helped her with it until her fingers ached. Time passed, but nothing in the life of the blind woman and her daughter changed. They still had to live hand to mouth and save every dollar. But the older April got, the more pronounced the social difference between her and her peers became. Once during her senior year, April didn't have a uniform for PE. Of course, her mother didn't have the money to buy her even a cheap tracksuit and sneakers. Trying to help her daughter, Julia suggested that April could wear her old uniform, which had been gathering dust in the closet for many years. Being blind, the woman didn't see how much fashion had changed and didn't realize that her uniform looked ridiculous now. Meanwhile, the girl saved up some money by skipping lunches and got herself some sneakers. But when she came to the gym class in her mother's old uniform, her classmates greeted her by laughing out loud. "Just look at what April's wearing. Where did you even get this junk? Did you steal it from some homeless person?" said Patrick Johnson, whose parents were wealthy landowners. At that moment, April would have gladly disappeared off the face of the earth. She knew that she would never forget that gym class. Having returned home, April closed herself in her room and cried almost until the evening. The unfortunate Julia couldn't understand what was happening to her daughter. Ultimately, she chalked it up to teenage problems that everyone has at her age. Meanwhile, April never found the strength to tell her mother the truth. The teenage girl was looking forward to the graduation, which would finally let her leave the hated school and her heartless classmates behind. Since April had no money for an evening attire, she refused to go to the prom or the graduation party that was held in honor of the graduates. But the lack of money wasn't the only reason the teenager decided against taking part in the celebration. Another reason was the fact that April didn't have a date to the prom. Her classmates' parents all advised their sons not to ask the poor girl out, so as to not spoil the pictures with her cheap look. And now, 10 years after the graduation, her class decided to hold a reunion. Deep down, April was very amused by the fact that after the horrible way they all treated her, someone still thought it would be appropriate to invite her to the reunion. Suddenly, the voice of her assistant pulled April out of her painful memories. "Mrs. Dawson, where should I send your order?" "Send it to the manager of the restaurant located on Park Street. And one more thing, make it anonymous. And make sure everything is of the best of quality." April answered and rubbed her temples warily. That night, she had an important event to attend, which she'd been waiting for all these 10 years, drawing various pictures and images in her head. All of April's former classmates gathered at the best restaurant in town. The only person missing was April Dawson, but her absence didn't bother anyone. Everyone saw her as a poor beggar and assumed that she was probably living in some cheap motel with some alcoholic biker. The former classmates were cheerfully talking amongst themselves, exchanging news and checking each other out. All of the attendees had long forgotten about April Dawson when the door of the restaurant suddenly swung open and young people in expensive uniforms brought in shiny packages. "Courier delivery? Did someone decide to give us gifts?" one of the attendees exclaimed in surprise. Imagine everyone's surprise when each of them got a beautifully decorated package with the personalized inscription, which included the initials of the owner. "Wow, who is so generous?" asked Simon Green, who was once the best quarterback on the high school football team. Talking excitedly, the guests opened the packages and found expensive clothes inside, all embroidered with the initials of a famous couturier, A.D. The men got a 3-piece suit, and the women each got an evening dress. But the most interesting part was waiting for them at the bottom of the packages, each of which contained a fashion magazine with the photograph of the successful couturier on the cover. When the guests took a closer look, they recognized the woman on the cover as their former classmate, April Dawson. At the same moment, the restaurant administrator came into the room and informed the guest in a well-trained voice that it was April Dawson who organized their class reunion. Needless to say, the administrator's speech had an incredible effect on all those present. As it turned out a little later, April Dawson, whom they always ridiculed in school, made an impressive career in the last 10 years and went from an ordinary seamstress to a world-famous couturier. By giving her classmates a set of clothes, April wanted to make them realize that they shouldn't laugh at those less fortunate, because one day the tables may turn, and they might end up being the ones who are being laughed at. Leaving the restaurant at the end of the dinner, each of the attendees were deep in their thoughts. Some envied April's wild success, while others, on the contrary, felt shame for the fact that they were once so cruel to the poor girl, mocking and humiliating her. But one thing they all knew for sure: they would definitely raise their children to be better people, to be kind and compassionate, and will teach them not to humiliate the weak and defenseless. Meanwhile, April Dawson continues to conquer new horizons, living her best life with her mother and her beloved husband, whom she met during a fashion show in Milan. Looking at April now, most people assume that she grew up in a wealthy family and never knew what poverty was. And only Julia Dawson knew what her daughter had to go through in order to succeed and conquer the Olympus of the fashion business.